No one can predict exactly when the major world cities are most likely to be underwater. Sea levels are rising rapidly, and the rate at which they are rising has more than doubled. Here is a list of popular places from the USA, Europe, Africa, to Asia that might soon be underwater. Miami, the USA. Miami is one of the cities that are sinking. The sea level is rising on an average of 1 inch every 3 years. It is 8 inches higher than in 1950. Scientists now think that in the next 15 years, the sea level rise will occur by another 6 inches at a slightly higher rate. Parts of Miami are so flooded that Hugh Jackman can have a whole fight scene in an underwater concert hall. The kind of sea level rise that can permanently flood the entire ground floor of a concert hall is higher than the most extreme climate projections for Miami, at least by 2100. Yes, Miami is one of the places that will disappear soon. Alexandria, Egypt. There are more cultural heritage sites at risk in Egypt's ancient seaport of Alexandria. Founded by Alexander the Great around 330 BC, the modern metropolis could be lost to rising waters by 2050. Key sites include the Citadel of Kate Bay, built where the legendary Pharos Lighthouse once stood, Pompey's Pillar, and the ruins of the Temple of Serapeum and the Bibliotheca Alexandrina, a modern library built in remembrance of the city's revered ancient library and one of Egypt's major cultural venues. Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam. Central Vietnam, including the province ofTua Thien Hue, is also under threat of places that will disappear. Rising sea levels, combined with increased rain, will flood the low-lying plains in which the province sits. The royal city of Hue, which sits on the banks of the Song Huang, will likely be one of the hardest-hit places. The ultimate fact, this tourist spot might end up being one of the sinking cities that will be underwater soon. New Orleans, USA. There are cities that will disappear soon and might be one of the underwater cities in the near future. With so much of the so-called Big Easy below sea level, residents of Louisiana's flood-prone city and its beautiful heritage buildings face a perilous future. After being devastated by Hurricane Katrina in 2005, a $14 billion network of levees was built to protect the city. But if sea levels continue to rise, the sinking city could be overtaken. The Climate Central report points to an 89% risk of at least one flood over 6 feet taking place between today and 2050 in the New Orleans area. Bangkok, Thailand. Home to an estimated 10 million people, Thailand's sprawling capital is sinking and is likely to be one of the cities worst hit by rising sea levels, according to Climate Central's data. The megacity, which sits on the delta of the Chao Phraya River and is laced with canals, has suffered major floods in recent years, with buildings eroded by rising waters. But soon, it could sink into the sea entirely, taking with it ancient temples, holy shrines, and opulent palaces. Houston, the USA. Since Houston isn't a coastal city, it's unlikely to be wiped out by sea level rise alone and become one of the cities that will disappear. But an increase in storms and hurricanes, combined with its low elevation and sinking terrain, could cause parts of the city to be abandoned places underwater, frequently in the future. During Hurricane Harvey, the Houston neighborhood of Harrisburg, Manchester, didn't flood as much as some other parts of the city. But if greenhouse gas emissions continue unchecked, it won't be so lucky. The area will eventually be permanently one of the places that will disappear in your lifetime. Venice, Italy. Venice in Italy will be another place that will soon be underwater by 2 millimeters every year. The Venetian capital has already been hit by severe flooding, and climate change is likely to increase the frequency of high tides that submerge it. Like New Orleans, Venice has a system of flood defense systems in place. But as the crisis worsens, these will be more difficult and expensive to maintain. Key West, Florida. Flooding has long blighted America's oldest city, St. Augustine, near Key West, and it will continue to do so since the city is reportedly one of the East Coast locations most under threat. According to the report, There is a 64% risk of at least one flood over 4 feet taking place between today and 2050 in St. Augustine, Key West area. In 2016, Hurricane Matthew unleashed unprecedented flooding on the city's historic downtown area, which is presided over by waterside Fort Castillo de San Marcos, built by the Spanish in 1672. South Carolina. When it comes to rising seas, the South Carolina beauty of Charleston is a risky city to live in, according to the report. It found that there was a 34% risk of at least one flood over 5 feet taking place between now and 2050 in the Charleston County area. This leaves the historic city's buildings and homes very vulnerable to damage and destruction, particularly in its low-lying areas. Storm surges along Charleston Harbor are likely to become more commonplace and severe. The Marshall Islands. Projected sea level rise would mean 40% of the buildings in the Marshall Islands capital of Majuro would be permanently flooded and entire islands would disappear, potentially costing the Pacific country its status as a nation, according to a devastating new report from the World Bank. King tides are nothing new for the Marshall Islands, a nation made up of 29 low-lying coral atolls that stretch across more than 1 million square miles of the Pacific Ocean northeast of Australia by 2035. Fiji. The Pacific Islands of Fiji are also low-lying and vulnerable to changes in ocean levels. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change mentions that the village of Vunidogoloa was the first to begin relocating because of the rapid sea level rise, which is continuing to worsen. Since 1993, Fiji has recorded a 6-millimeter increase in its sea level per year, larger than the global average. The rapid rise in sea levels and the resulting saltwater intrusion that stems from the increased ferocity of coastal floods have made portions of the island nation uninhabitable. New Orleans. With much of the so-called Big Easy below sea level, residents of Louisiana's flood-prone city and the beautiful heritage buildings face a perilous future. After being devastated by Hurricane Katrina in 2005, a $14 billion network of levees was built to protect the city. But if sea levels continue to rise, the sinking city could be overtaken. The Climate Central report points to an 89% risk of at least one flood over 1.8 meters taking place between today and 2050 in the New Orleans area. Discover all the reasons you should explore New Orleans now. Abidjan, Ivory Coast. The Abidjan Ivory Coast is sinking. In the past 30 years, residents of the once thriving historic town 140 kilometers southwest of the Ivorian capital Abidjan have seen their prison, hospital, and school be subsumed by the waters. Some of the villagers have started to exhume the bodies of relatives for fear of their graves being lost to the sea. Not all have managed to do so on time. Coastal flooding is not the only climate change threat facing Ivory Coast. Rains came late this year in the northern part of the country, causing even drought-resistant crops to wither and die. Amsterdam, Netherlands flood. Amsterdam and the cities of Rotterdam and The Hague sit low, flat, and close to the North Sea. The Dutch are famed for their flood defenses, and looking at these sea level projections, it seems the country's system of dikes, dams, barriers, levees, and floodgates will become even more essential in the years to come. But the country we know today has been artificially held together for centuries by dikes, pumps, and polders, and sea levels, now rising at an average of about 3 millimeters a year, risk overwhelming our water defenses. If this happens, the government's Delta program estimates that 60% of the country could be flooded. Shanghai, China. Shanghai translates as city on the sea, but the megacity could soon be under the sea, according to the data from Climate Control. In fact, it is one of China's most endangered cities. The Yangtze Delta, where Shanghai is located, as well as the Pearl River Delta, home to Guangzhou, capital of the Guangdong province, are extremely vulnerable to flooding, with perilously high concentrations of people living on low-lying land. A map in the research shows the old and new projections for 2050 for Shanghai. the city's center becomes deep blue in the new projection, which means it will be below the high tide line. Manila, Philippines. Another Asian megacity extremely vulnerable to rising sea levels is Manila in the Philippines, which is home to around 6.8 million people. According to the map, the capital will be submerged by 2050, along with other parts of the Pacific Ocean archipelago. The report found that 5.4 million Filipinos are already living on land set below annual flood levels. Now read 17 destinations you should visit while you still can. Guayaquil, Ecuador. Guayaquil, Ecuador's largest city with around 3 million inhabitants, is among the most vulnerable coastal cities in the world. Earthquakes are a constant threat because of their location close to the Pacific Ring of Fire. An intensified rainy season has increased the risk of floods. Studies repeatedly rank it as one of the top cities most likely to sustain major damage caused by rising sea levels. In 2013, the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change ranked Guayaquil among the 10 cities most at risk from rising sea levels, which, by 2050, could range from between 20 and 80 centimeters in a worst-case scenario. Rotterdam, Netherlands. As discussed before, much of the nation sits below sea level and is gradually sinking. Now, climate change brings the prospect of rising tides and fiercer storms. 90% of the city of Rotterdam lies below sea level, leaving many residential areas vulnerable to a rising ocean. Don DeBaki, senior advisor for flood defenses at the Rijkswaterstaat from 2009 to 2019, explains. Consider that the Netherlands can probably cope with a rise of around 1 to 1.5 meters in sea level, while 2 meters or more will require a total rethinking of the current defenses. Calms, Libya. Calms is located on the Mediterranean coast of Libya and is the home to one of the world's heritage sites. This was a very prominent city and was apparently one of the most beautiful cities, filled with markets, public monuments, and residential areas. Not to mention, the harbor is said to be one of the best preserved sites. There is already regular flooding in this area, so a prediction of the sea level rising as much as 3 feet in the area within the coming decades. It is a place that is at great risk of being submerged sooner rather than later, or, at the very least, widely inaccessible. London flood. Global warming has put London at risk of sinking, along with other major cities, as rising sea levels spell more flooding along the Thames estuary, according to the Climate Central report. Without radical coastal reinforcement strategies, the rise would see large parts of the capital underwater. Particularly vulnerable areas lie along the length of the River Thames, the setting for some of the capital's most important buildings, such as the Tower of London and Houses of Parliament, and cultural spaces, including the Tate Modern and Shakespeare's Globe. Atlantic City. According to a firm out of Delaware, rising sea levels will leave Atlantic City uninhabitable by the end of the century. Atlantic City is one of the top American cities at risk of being underwater in 60 years. Atlantic City is number 3 on that list. The firm used data assuming a 3-foot increase in sea level by 2060 and a 6.5-foot increase by 2100. 50% of Atlantic City will be uninhabitable by 2060, and by 2100, 92.8% of the city will be underwater, the research found. Daintree Rainforest. Logging is causing a devastating effect on the Daintree, with more logging causing an endangerment or extinction of some unique plants in the rainforest. The biodiversity of the forest is dropping, with more and more animals losing their homes. Now, I have some good news here. The fact that the Daintree is going to be the only rainforest on the planet that's growing, not shrinking, is pretty cool. Planting trees does strike a chord with people who want to see our turnaround from this destructive path we're on. Ravenna. Ravenna is located in Italy. This place is well known for its late Roman architecture, but it is also the home to the most important group of Byzantine art, most of which are housed in the early Christian mausoleums and basilicas, whether interested in art history or Christianity, or really none of the above. The city itself holds an important historical significance, as it was once the capital of the Western Roman Empire. Unfortunately, it is believed that this place could be submerged in water, with the treasures being flooded as early as 2050. Elephanta Caves. Off the western coast of India is Elephanta Island, which harbors a major archaeological site, the Elephanta Caves. The sculptures and carvings, thought to be around 1,500 years old, are among the most perfect expressions of Indian art according to UNESCO. The main cave holds a 23-foot-tall representation of the Hindu god Shiva in three aspects: creator, preserver, and destroyer. The caves are already under pressure from monsoons, litterbugs, graffiti, nearby industry, water seepage, and the ravages of time. Global warming of just 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit and the rising seas that come with it would threaten the cave. Galveston. The Houston-Galveston region is particularly vulnerable to climate change due to its population density. The area is the fifth largest in the U.S. by population size. It is also an important economic hub due to its major port and cargo hub and its significant role in energy production for the nation. If the worst climate change predictions come true, hundreds of coastal U.S. towns and cities could disappear underwater by 2100. But some believe Galveston will not be underwater even at high tide in 100 years. It will be somewhat smaller as the water nibbles around the edges. Tybee Island. Tybee Island has an average elevation of 7.5 feet. Bi-monthly spring tides often exceed 9 feet, which explains flooded highways and yards. While sea levels have risen, the major cause of the flooding is that the Tybee area is sinking. Onshore winds and low-pressure systems off the coast often aggravate flooding by pushing water against the shore and allowing successive tides to build up. On those occasions, sewer pipes on parts of Tybee Island fill with seawater and cannot drain into the ocean, so backflow occurs. Honolulu. Data shows that Honolulu is expected to begin seeing regular flooding of its urban core in as little as 15 years. If the state loses Waikiki Beach, it would lose the $2 billion in annual revenue from tourists who flock to the area, Lee said. And if a major hurricane strikes Hawaii, the damage could total $40 billion. By 2050, the sea level in Hawaii could rise by as much as 1 foot. Tabasco City, Mexico. With a coastline on the Gulf of Mexico, the low, flat state of Tabasco is no stranger to flooding, and it could eventually be completely consumed. The rural region is covered in wetlands and forest and is already subject to seasonal floods, but the sea level's rise could submerge it entirely. This would threaten impressive archaeological sites such as the Mayan ruins of Malpasito and Comalcalco and its charming colonial city. Parts of Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula and Baja California are also vulnerable to global sea level rises. Hoboken. Hoboken, as we know it, could possibly be underwater by the year 2100. Climate change is causing sea levels all over the world to rise. Coastal regions will be confronted with difficult decisions in the near future if they fail to respond to the challenges now. According to the UCS study, nearly 30% of Hoboken homes will be at risk of chronic flooding by 2060. Hoboken is uniquely vulnerable to rising sea levels because more than half of its residents, schools, hospital, and all of its rail stations, ferry terminals, and hazardous waste sites are within 5 feet of its high tides. Hilton Head Island. In approximately 80 years, 31 communities in the U.S. will be underwater, including these close to home: St. Helena Island, West Ashley, James Island, Central Charleston, Mount Pleasant, and Hilton Head Island. Overall, Hilton Head Island has an extreme risk of flooding over the next 30 years, which means flooding is likely to impact day-to-day life within the community. Hilton Head Island is already above 3.05 meters sea level. Chesapeake. Oceans rise at an average rate of 6 inches every 100 years. The sea level in the Chesapeake Bay rises at a faster rate than average because the land underneath the bay is sinking. While most of the action occurred on land, the Chesapeake Bay was itself a player on the stage of the Civil War. The famous Clash of the Ironclads that occurred in the waters off Hampton Roads, Virginia, is one example of how the war played out on the bay. California. Between $8 billion and $10 billion of existing property in California is likely to be underwater by 2050, with an additional $6 billion to $10 billion at risk during high tides. 4 feet of higher water levels would cause daily flooding for nearly 28,000 socially vulnerable residents in the San Francisco Bay Area region. Under scenarios of 3 to 6 feet of SLR, up to 2/3 of Southern California beaches may become completely eroded by 2100. Manila flood. Most of Metro Manila is between 5 to 10 meters above sea level, with higher elevations toward the east. However, some waterfront areas are slightly below sea level, and others are rapidly sinking due to groundwater extraction in the 1990s and 2000s. Combined with rising seas, several areas may be flooded in a few decades. Manila in the Philippines is among the fastest sinking cities on the planet, with some areas subsiding up to 1.5 centimeters per year. Yangon. We should not ignore the fact that sea levels are expected to rise rapidly unless global warming is maintained at 1.5 degrees centigrade or lower, above the pre-industrial levels, an ambitious target set by the Paris Climate Agreement. Thus, the worsening climate change, the effect of the rising sea levels due to the melting of ice glaciers, could exacerbate the floods in the Yangon area in the near future. So eventually, Yangon will soon be underwater. Easter Island, Chile. The most famous Easter Island and its iconic Moai statues are gravely at risk from sea level rise and rainfall. The island is already undergoing significant erosion, and the rising waves inch closer to the heritage site every year. UNESCO recognized Easter Island and Rapa Nui State Park as a Chilean site of global cultural heritage in 1995 because of the large megalithic shrines built on the island between 1400 and 1650 AD by a Polynesian society dating back to 300 AD. The Maldives. Over 90 islands in the Maldives already experience flooding each year, and they are projected to lose 80% or more of their islands in the next 3 decades. Plans are already being made by the local government to purchase land in other countries as insurance for relocating the Maldivian population if necessary. Dhaka, Bangladesh. A 2007 World Bank report estimated that 300,000 to 400,000 migrants arrive in Dhaka each year, with salinity intrusion considered a major factor why so many are fleeing the country's coastal belt. These migrants usually end up in the city's poorest, most flood-prone areas. There are few other places to go when your country is being slowly swallowed by the sea. Climate experts predict that by 2050, rising sea levels will submerge some 17% of the nation's land and displace about 20 million people. And the whole of Bangladesh is roughly the size of Iowa. So Dhaka, for so many of its transplants, is a city of last resort. Lagos, Nigeria. Lagos is the most populated city in Africa, with more than 24 million people residing here. It is also the most vulnerable to sea level rise caused by climate change. With time, the intensity of rain is expected to increase, which will leave behind flooded streets full of rubbish as the disposal system of Lagos is dysfunctional. Whenever there is heavy downpour, rubbish piles up in open gutters and therefore moving in the streets gets difficult. It has been predicted that 90 centimeters of sea level rise can occur if global warming exceeds 2 degrees centigrade by 2100. The whole architecture of Lagos needs to be rebuilt in order to survive the effects of sea level rise. Jakarta, Indonesia. Jakarta, Indonesia is the fastest sinking city in the world. North Jakarta is expected to submerge underwater up to 95% by the end of 2050 and has already sunk 2.5 meters in the last 10 years, and continuously sank by almost 25 centimeters every year. The rate of sinking is double the global average for coastal megacities of the world. It is sinking by an average of 1 to 15 centimeters per year, with almost half the cities submerged under the sea. Nothing could be more alarming than this. North Jakarta has long been one of the busiest port cities of Indonesia. New York City. Another of the world's major cities facing an uncertain future is New York City. In fact, the entire state of New York is under threat. According to the report, there is a 68% risk of at least